August 2011. The scent of baked bread floods the strip mall. Outside, the summer heat radiates off black asphalt. Inside, fluorescent lights hum above freshly stacked vegetables. Subway has just crossed an invisible threshold. 34,218 locations. More than McDonald's, more than Starbucks, more than any restaurant chain in human history. The yellow napkins pile high on counters from Tokyo to Toronto. A 17-year-old kid in Ohio makes his 1,000th sandwich. An investor in Connecticut counts his dividends. The franchise machine hums. Everyone wins. This is the peak. This is the moment before gravity remembers to pull. But peaks are optical illusions. What looked like triumph was already rot. Because when you build an empire by selling the dream instead of protecting the dreamers, when you prioritize locations over location survival, when you treat human beings like ATM machines in aprons, you don't build a business. You build a time bomb wrapped in yellow paper. This is not a story about sandwiches. This is a story about what happens when ambition becomes cancer, when growth becomes religion, when eat fresh becomes the cruelest joke ever printed on a napkin. The year was 1965. Bridgeport, Connecticut, a city built on factories and broken dreams, where the smell of Long Island Sound mixed with diesel exhaust and the quiet desperation of people who worked with their hands. Fred DeLuca was 17 years old, staring at a future that looked like a wall. College tuition at the University of Bridgeport was $2,000 a year. His family's bank account contained maybe $300. The gap was not just financial, it was existential. His father worked in construction. His mother cleaned houses. They had given him everything they could, which was barely enough to survive, let alone thrive. Fred was smart. Not book smart in the way that wins scholarships. Street smart in the way that recognizes patterns others miss. He saw how money moved in his neighborhood. He saw who had it and who didn't. He saw that the people with money didn't work harder. They owned things. They extracted value from other people's labor. And he decided, with the clarity that only desperate young men possess, that he would rather be the extractor than the extracted. So he did what desperate young men have done since the beginning of commerce. He asked someone older, richer, and more reckless than himself for help. That someone was Peter Buck, a nuclear physicist earning $40,000 a year at General Electric. Comfortable, but not wealthy. Curious, but not stupid. Well, not usually stupid. Because when Fred approached him at a family cookout in Armonk, New York, with the vague notion of opening a submarine sandwich shop, Buck did something categorically insane. He said yes, more than yes. He wrote a check for $1,000 while standing next to the grill, beer in hand, smoke in his eyes. The terms were simple. Fred would run the shop. Buck would provide the capital. They would split ownership 50-50. No contracts, no lawyers. Just a handshake between a teenager with no experience and a scientist who decided to gamble grocery money on ambition and bread. They called it Pete's Super Submarines. The name was garbage. Too long, too clumsy, the kind of name that dies in a market economy before the first lease payment clears. The location was worse. A tiny storefront at 3851 Main Street in Bridgeport, where the rent was cheap because the neighborhood was cheaper. The building was a converted garage. The ceiling was low. The ventilation was poor. The floor sloped toward a drain that smelled like decades of neglect. But the rent was $100 a month, which meant they could afford to fail slowly instead of immediately. The menu was basic by necessity, not choice. Submarine sandwiches made to order, assembled in front of customers on a wooden cutting board scarred by years of previous tenants' failures. No deep fryers, no grills, no pizza ovens. Just cold cuts, cheese, vegetables and bread delivered every morning from a local bakery. The margins were thin, the hours were brutal. Fred worked alone most days, opening at 6 in the morning to prep vegetables and closing near midnight after scrubbing the cutting boards with bleach and prayer. His hands smelled like onions and vinegar. His back ached from standing on concrete. He made maybe $10 profit on a good day. Most days were not good days. The first year was a controlled disaster. They sold 47 sandwiches opening day, 32 the second day, 21 the third. The numbers dwindled as novelty evaporated and reality set in. Bridgeport did not need another place to buy lunch. The city was saturated with delis, pizzerias, diners, all owned by people with more experience and better locations. Fred and Peter had nothing except desperation and a storefront that smelled like mildew. But Fred was learning, watching, calculating. Because Fred DeLuca was not a chef. He was not an artist. He was a machine that learned patterns. And the pattern he saw was this. People did not want fancy. They wanted fast, cheap, and clean. They wanted to see their food being made so they could pretend they had control over what went into their bodies. They wanted to believe they were making healthy choices, even when they were drowning vegetables in mayonnaise. And most importantly, they wanted predictability. The same sandwich in the same wrapper from the same kind of store, no matter where they were. This revelation was not original. Ray Kroc had already weaponized it at McDonald's. Colonel Sanders had franchised it across the South. But Fred saw an angle they had missed. Submarines were not burgers. Submarines could be positioned as healthier, fresher, more customizable. You could load them with lettuce and tomatoes and convince yourself you were eating a salad with some meat inside instead of the reverse. The illusion was the product. The sandwich was just the delivery mechanism. By 1968, Fred had opened a second location, then a third. He borrowed money from family. He borrowed money from friends. He borrowed money from banks that should have known better. He slept 4 hours a night on a cot in the back of the original store. He ate mistakes and stale bread to save costs. He calculated every penny. He fired employees who stole pickles. He negotiated with suppliers like a man holding a knife to his own throat, which, economically speaking, he was. Peter Buck stayed in the shadows, content to let the teenager with fire in his blood run the operation while he collected his share of profits that barely existed. The name changed in 1968. Pete's Super Submarines became Subway. The change was surgical. Subway was short, memorable, modern. It implied movement, speed, progress. The logo evolved from hand-drawn typography to something cleaner, more corporate. The yellow napkins appeared around this time, bright and cheap and disposable, stacked next to the register like little flags marking territory. They cost almost nothing. They branded everything. Customers took them home. The napkins spread like spores. By 1974, Fred had 16 locations scattered across Connecticut. Most were break-even operations. A few were profitable. None were spectacular. But Fred was not chasing spectacular. He was chasing scale. Because scale changes the game. Scale creates leverage. Scale turns a sandwich shop into a system. And systems, unlike sandwiches, can be sold. Franchising was the answer. Fred studied McDonald's. He studied Howard Johnson's. He studied every chain that had figured out how to grow without capital. The model was elegant in its brutality. You sell people the tools to build their own prison. You brand their labor. You extract rent from their sweat. You take no risk. You absorb no losses. You simply collect fees and move on to the next dreamer. The Subway franchise model launched in 1974. The pitch was simple. For $5,000, later rising to $10,000, then $15,000, you could own your own Subway. Not a fake ownership. Real ownership. Your name on the lease. Your signature on the loans. Your body behind the counter. The American dream made tangible. Independence, freedom. A business of your own. But here was the genius, the cruelty that built an empire. Subway kept the barrier to entry lower than anyone else. McDonald's required $400,000 and pristine credit. Burger King demanded similar investments. Kentucky Fried Chicken wanted $200,000 minimum. Subway asked for $15,000 and a willingness to bleed. You could open a Subway anywhere. In a gas station, in a strip mall, in a converted closet. Anywhere with 100 square feet and access to electricity. No kitchen required. No grills, no fryers, no massive ventilation systems, just a refrigerator, a prep table, a bread oven, and a human being willing to work 14-hour days slicing turkey. And people came, not thousands immediately, but steadily. Teachers who wanted to escape classrooms where they made $18,000 a year dealing with children who didn't care. Factory workers who wanted to escape floors where their bodies were used until they broke. Immigrants who wanted to escape invisibility. Who saw in that yellow and green logo something they recognized from television, a piece of America they could own. They signed the contracts in kitchens and living rooms. They read the fine print or didn't. They paid the fees. They borrowed from relatives. They mortgaged houses. They opened the stores, and Subway grew. The growth was not linear, it was exponential, cancerous. By 1980, Subway had 200 locations. By 1985, they had 1,000. By 1990, they had 5,000. The numbers stopped being about sandwiches and started being about something else. Mathematics. Leverage. The realization that every location meant more fees, more royalties, more advertising contributions, more control. Fred DeLuca had discovered what retail empires spend centuries learning. The fastest way to grow is not to build quality. It is to sell the appearance of quality to people who have no other options. The franchisees paid 8% of gross sales as royalties, not net, gross. Every dollar that came through the register, Subway took 8 cents. Then they paid another 4.5% for advertising, 12.5% total, before food costs, before labor, before rent, before electricity, before anything. And the advertising fee was not optional. It was mandatory. A tax on existence. The money went into a national fund controlled by Subway, spent on commercials and billboards designed to drive traffic to all locations equally, which meant the franchisee in rural Nebraska paid the same rate as the franchisee in Manhattan who actually benefited from the advertising. But wait, there was more. Because Subway controlled the supply chain, franchisees were required to purchase ingredients from approved vendors. Approved by whom? By Subway. Who negotiated those vendor contracts? Subway. Who profited from those vendor relationships? Subway. The bread, the meat, the vegetables, the napkins, the cups, the plastic gloves, the cleaning supplies, all of it funneled through systems designed to extract maximum revenue while maintaining plausible deniability about quality. The franchisee had no choice. The contracts were clear. Deviation meant termination. Termination meant you lost everything you had invested. So you bought the approved ingredients at the approved prices, and you shut your mouth and you made sandwiches. The quality was negotiable. The bread arrived frozen, manufactured in industrial facilities by companies like Arizda and Lineage Logistics, par-baked and flash-frozen, shipped in trucks to distribution centers, then delivered to stores where employees baked them in convection ovens that filled the air with the smell of yeast and chemicals. The smell was the point. The smell was marketing. It made people hungry. It made people trust. Fresh-baked bread, except it wasn't fresh, it was reanimated. A corpse made to walk through the thermal manipulation. The meat arrived pre-sliced and vacuum-sealed. Turkey that was 90% turkey. Ham that was 80% ham. The rest was water, salt, sugar, preservatives, compounds with names like sodium erythorbate and sodium nitrite, chemicals that kept the meat pink and prevented botulism and made sure the product could survive weeks in refrigeration without turning into a biohazard. The taste was adequate, not good, not bad, just adequate, optimized for cost and consistency, because when you have 5,000 locations, you cannot afford variation. You cannot afford craftsmanship. You can only afford the appearance of freshness. The vegetables were the illusion's crown jewel. Lettuce, tomatoes, onions, green peppers, pickles, olives, delivered fresh or fresh enough, depending on the supply chain's mood. The vegetables looked healthy. They looked crisp. They looked like something you would buy at a farmer's market if farmer's markets sold industrial produce shipped in refrigerated trucks from California and Mexico. But they were there, visible, abundant. Customers loaded them onto sandwiches with the enthusiasm of people convincing themselves that eating vegetables makes processed meat healthy. The franchisees sliced them every morning, bags full of onions that made them cry, tomatoes that bled onto cutting boards, lettuce that wilted under fluorescent lights. It was labor. Unpaid labor if you were the owner. Minimum wage labor if you hired someone. Either way, it was extractive. The yellow napkins multiplied. They became ubiquitous. Not just at Subway locations, but everywhere. People took stacks of them home. They used them for car spills and kitchen messes and children's nosebleeds. The napkins were thin, single-ply, barely absorbent, but they were free and they were everywhere. The yellow was specific. Not lemon yellow. Not gold, a cheap industrial yellow that looked bright under fluorescent lights and faded to beige under sunlight. The napkins absorbed grease and Coca-Cola and ketchup and the small failures of everyday life. They were disposable. They were designed to be disposable, just like the franchisees. By the mid-1990s, Subway had 10,000 locations. Fred DeLuca was a millionaire many times over, though he lived modestly, still working 80-hour weeks, still obsessing over every detail of the operation. Peter Buck had become a billionaire through passive ownership, spending his time on yachts and philanthropic ventures, content to let Fred run the machine while he collected dividends. The partnership had worked beyond anyone's reasonable expectations. A $1,000 investment had become a multi-billion-dollar empire. The American dream in spreadsheet form, but behind the numbers, behind the success, behind the yellow napkins stacking higher in landfills across America, the franchisees were struggling. Not all of them. Some had great locations, some had the capital to weather slow periods, some had the business acumen to optimize their operations. But many, maybe most, were barely surviving. They worked alone or with one minimum wage employee. They opened at 6 in the morning and closed at 10 at night. They made sandwiches until their hands cramped. They cleaned until their backs ached. They paid their fees every week like clockwork because missing a payment meant Subway's lawyers appeared in their mailbox with termination notices. And at the end of the month, After paying rent and utilities and food costs and employee wages and loan payments and franchise fees, they had maybe $1,000 left, maybe $2,000 if they were lucky, maybe nothing if they weren't. And then Subway opened another location down the street. Not across town, not in a different neighborhood, down the street, sometimes across the intersection, sometimes in the same plaza. Because Subway's growth model was not about making existing franchisees successful, it was about adding new locations and new fees. Market saturation was not a bug. It was the strategy. Flood the market with Subways until every consumer is within walking distance of one. If that means existing franchisees suffer, that's acceptable. That's collateral damage. That's capitalism. The franchisees protested, they formed coalitions, they hired lawyers. They demanded protection from market saturation. They demanded reforms in the fee structure. They demanded to be treated like partners instead of revenue streams. Subway responded with legal threats and silence. The contracts were clear. Subway had the right to open new locations wherever they wanted. Franchisees had no territorial protection. The system was designed this way. Complaining was not a strategy. Working harder was the strategy. And if you couldn't work harder, well, that was a personal failure, not a systemic one. Some franchisees quit. They sold their stores to new dreamers or back to Subway corporate for pennies on the dollar. They walked away with debt and broken bodies and the knowledge that they had been used. Others adapted. They cut costs. They fired employees. They worked alone. They stopped maintaining their stores. The bathrooms got dirtier. The counters got stickier. The vegetables got older. The experience degraded. But the fees kept coming. The system kept extracting, and Subway kept growing. The international expansion accelerated through the 1990s. Subway entered the United Kingdom in 1996, opening locations in Brighton and London that immediately attracted crowds curious about American fast food culture. The British market was different. Fish and chips dominated. Greggs sold affordable sausage rolls, but Subway positioned itself as modern, clean, aspirational. The Queen's English mixed with American efficiency. By 2000, Subway had 300 locations across the UK. The yellow napkins appeared in Glasgow and Manchester and Birmingham. The same thin paper, the same industrial yellow, the same promise of freshness in a country where freshness meant something entirely different. Australia followed, Japan followed, Germany, France, Spain, Brazil, India, China. Subway's model translated easily because it required almost nothing, no cultural adaptation necessary, no menu modifications for local tastes, just sandwiches assembled the same way everywhere. The franchisees in Tokyo paid the same fees as franchisees in Texas, the same royalties, the same advertising contributions, the same lack of territorial protection. A Japanese schoolteacher who borrowed money to open a Subway in Shibuya discovered the same reality as an American factory worker who opened one in Ohio. The system was designed to extract, not to empower. And Subway grew globally, spreading like a virus, 30 countries, then 50, then 100, until there was barely a developed nation without yellow and green logos and thin paper napkins printed with promises nobody believed. By 2000, Subway had 15,000 locations. They were the fastest-growing restaurant chain in America. The press called it a phenomenon. Business schools studied it. Fred DeLuca gave speeches about entrepreneurship and franchising and the power of hard work. He never mentioned the franchisees who failed. He never mentioned the saturation strategy. He never mentioned that the system only worked because most franchisees accepted poverty wages in exchange for the illusion of ownership. He talked about opportunity, and people believed him, because people want to believe that hard work leads to success, that ownership means freedom, that the yellow napkins stacked on the counter represent something real instead of something disposable. And then came Jared Fogle, the man who would become Subway's greatest asset and their most catastrophic liability. His story entered Subway's mythology in 2000. A college student at Indiana University, overweight by 245 pounds, unable to tie his shoes, unable to climb stairs without stopping, desperate for change. He started eating Subway twice a day. A 6-inch turkey sub for lunch, a foot-long veggie sub for dinner. He walked to the Subway instead of driving. He stopped drinking 2-liter bottles of Mountain Dew. He stopped eating entire pizzas alone in his dorm room. The weight fell off, not because Subway was magic, because he stopped consuming 5,000 calories a day. But the narrative was irresistible. Lose weight eating Subway. Eat fresh and become healthy. The sandwiches were medicine. The bread was salvation. A local Indiana newspaper ran the story. Then a national wire service picked it up. Then Men's Health magazine featured it. Then Subway's marketing team saw it and recognized gold. They contacted Jared. They offered him money. Not a lot initially, $5,000 to appear in regional commercials. But it worked. The commercials went viral before viral was a thing. People remembered Jared. They remembered the oversized jeans he held up. They remembered his story. And Subway's sales increased. Not slightly. Significantly. Double-digit percentage growth attributed directly to Jared's campaign. So Subway paid him more. They made him the national spokesperson. They put his face on every commercial, every billboard, every advertisement. Jared appeared in over 300 commercials across 15 years. He became more recognizable than most actors. He traveled to schools preaching the gospel of eat fresh. He shook hands with children. He signed autographs. He smiled that empty smile of someone who had stumbled into relevance and decided to ride it until the wheels fell off. And for 15 years, it worked. Subway grew. Jared grew richer. The yellow napkins multiplied. By 2010, Subway was approaching 30,000 locations. They were on track to surpass McDonald's. The dream of the teenager from Bridgeport was manifesting. The biggest restaurant chain in the world, not the best. The biggest. Because big was the metric. Big was the goal. Big was everything. But behind the growth, behind the commercials, behind the $12.5 billion in annual revenue, the rot was spreading. The franchisees were forming a coalition called the North American Franchise Association, not to praise Subway, to fight Subway. They hired lawyers. They filed lawsuits. They demanded reforms. They wanted protection from market saturation. They wanted transparency in vendor contracts. They wanted to be heard. Subway responded with more legal threats, more silence, more new locations. The beast was hungry. The beast did not negotiate. The beast only grew. Meanwhile, competitors were circling. Quiznos had emerged in the late 1990s as the first serious threat to Subway's sandwich dominance. They offered toasted subs, higher quality ingredients, better bread. Their stores looked more upscale. Their sandwiches cost more, but tasted better. By 2007, Quiznos had 5,000 locations and was growing fast. Subway watched nervously. For the first time in decades, they faced genuine competition. So they responded the only way they knew how. They added toasted sandwiches to their menu. They called them toasted subs and marketed them aggressively. The quality was still mediocre, but now the mediocrity was warm. Customers didn't seem to notice or care. Quiznos continued growing, but Subway's scale advantage was insurmountable. They had 6 times as many locations. They had Jared. They had brand recognition. Quiznos could not compete with ubiquity. By 2014, Quiznos would collapse from their own mismanaged franchise system, closing thousands of locations and filing for bankruptcy. Subway watched them die and learned nothing about the dangers of exploiting franchisees. Jimmy John's appeared next. Founded in 1983 but expanding aggressively in the 2000s, they positioned themselves as the fast alternative to Subway. Freaky fast delivery, simple menu, limited options, higher quality ingredient. By 2010, they had 1,000 locations and were growing. They were not trying to be Subway. They were trying to be what Subway claimed to be: fresh, fast, and focused on quality. Their sandwiches were demonstrably better. Their stores were cleaner. Their employees seemed less dead inside. But they could not match Subway's scale. Nobody could. Subway was too big, too everywhere, too embedded in the American landscape. Jimmy John's carved out a niche. Subway dominated everything else. Panera Bread was different. They were not competing with Subway on price. They were competing on aspiration. Their stores looked like coffee shops. Their menu included salads and soups and pastries alongside sandwiches. Their prices were higher. Their customers were wealthier. They positioned themselves as the place you went when you wanted to feel good about your lunch choices, when you wanted to sit down and pretend you were eating at a real restaurant instead of a fast food chain. By 2010, Panera had 1,500 locations and was growing steadily. They were taking market share from Subway, not by being faster or cheaper, but by being better. Subway noticed. Subway did not care. Subway's customers were not Panera's customers. Subway's customers were broke, busy, and desperate for something quick. Panera could have their affluent suburban customers who paid $10 for half a sandwich. Subway would keep the rest of America. And then 2015 arrived, the year the facade cracked, the year the yellow napkins started to reveal the stains underneath. September 2015. Federal agents raided Jared Fogle's home in Zionsville, Indiana. The investigation had been ongoing for months. Quiet, methodical, building a case before making headlines. The FBI had been tipped off by a former employee of Jared's foundation, a non-profit he had created to fight childhood obesity. The irony was suffocating. The woman had recorded Jared discussing his sexual interest in minors. The recordings were clear. The evidence was overwhelming. When the raid happened, the press arrived like vultures. Cameras surrounded his house. Helicopters circled overhead. The story broke national. International. Subway's most recognizable face was a predator. The details emerged slowly, then all at once. Jared had paid for sex with minors. He had possessed and distributed child pornography. He had traveled interstate to abuse children. The charges were federal. The evidence was irrefutable. In August 2015, Jared pled guilty. He was sentenced to 15 years and 8 months in federal prison. The minimum was 5 years. The maximum was 50. The judge split the difference and added some extra weight for good measure. Jared's career was over. His reputation was destroyed. His life was finished. Subway severed ties immediately. They released statements expressing shock and disgust. They claimed they had no knowledge of his behavior. They scrubbed his image from every commercial, every poster, every website. They tried to pretend he had never existed. But you cannot erase 15 years of association. You cannot undo 300 commercials. You cannot ask parents to forget that the man who smiled at their children in school assemblies, who told them to eat fresh and exercise, was a monster. The damage was instant. The damage was catastrophic. Subway's sales dropped. Their reputation, carefully constructed over decades, collapsed in weeks. The yellow napkins, once symbols of cleanliness and health, now carried the stain of something unspeakable. But this was not the only wound. This was simply the most visible, because while the world focused on Jared, Fred DeLuca was dying. Literally. Leukemia. Diagnosed in 2013, hidden from the public, managed in silence while he continued to run the empire with the same ruthless efficiency that built it. He underwent treatment. He worked from hospital beds. He attended meetings via video conference when he was too weak to stand. He refused to let go, because Subway was not just his business. It was his identity. It was proof that the 17-year-old kid from Bridgeport who had nothing could build something that mattered, or at least something that was big. He died on September 14, 2015. One day after Jared was sentenced. The timing was Shakespearean. The founder and the spokesman, the architect and the actor, both fell in the same season. And the empire they built together began to sink. Fred's death left a vacuum. His sister, Suzanne Greco, took over as CEO. She had worked at Subway since 1968, starting as a teenager, making sandwiches alongside Fred. She understood the business. She understood the systems. But she was not Fred. Fred was obsession incarnated. Fred would work 20-hour days and demand the same from everyone around him. Fred saw patterns and adapted. Fred built the machine. Suzanne inherited the machine, and machines, when they stop being fed, start eating themselves. The problems multiplied like bacteria. Sales declined for the first time in decades. The Jared scandal had destroyed trust with parents. The market saturation had destroyed profitability for franchisees. The food quality had destroyed credibility with customers. The stores themselves felt different, darker, dirtier, sadder. Customers noticed. They stopped coming, or they came less often. Or they went to Chipotle instead, or Panera Bread, or literally anywhere else that felt less contaminated by scandal and decay. The franchisee revolt reached critical mass. Lawsuits became routine. Franchisees accused Subway of fraud, of misrepresentation, of violating franchise agreements by oversaturating markets and refusing to provide territorial protection. They presented evidence, financial records showing that new Subway locations cannibalized existing ones. Market analyses proving that saturation destroyed individual store profitability. Testimonies from franchisees who had lost their homes, their savings, their health working 16-hour days trying to survive Subway's fee structure. One case that gained national attention involved a franchisee named Kumar Patel, who had opened 3 Subway locations in suburban Michigan in 2008. He invested $200,000 of his family's savings. He worked 19-hour days. He followed every corporate mandate. And in 2015, Subway opened 4 new locations within 2 miles of his stores. His sales dropped 40%. He could not afford the fees. He could not afford the rent. He declared bankruptcy in 2016. He lost everything. His story was not unique. It was typical. But Subway's response was always the same. The problem was not the system. The problem was individual failure. Work harder, adapt, or get out. Stories like this emerged everywhere. A franchisee in California who worked alone in her store for 3 years, sleeping in the back room, making barely enough to pay fees and rent, finally closing in 2017 after Subway opened 2 locations in her plaza. A franchisee in Texas who mortgaged his house to open a Subway, then watched as Subway terminated his contract after he complained about market saturation, leaving him with $300,000 in debt and no business. A franchisee in New York who discovered that Subway's approved vendors were overcharging by 30% compared to independent suppliers, but was legally prohibited from buying elsewhere. The stories accumulated, the lawsuits multiplied, and Subway kept extracting fees. This is the point where I pause and acknowledge something. Stories like Subway's are not just corporate case studies. They are warnings etched in spreadsheets and bankruptcy filings. They are the residue of decisions made in rooms where the people suffering the consequences never had a seat. If you find value in these autopsies, in understanding how empires built on promises collapse under their own weight, subscribe to this channel. Your support allows us to continue excavating the ruins of American commerce. Let's return to the final years of Subway's decline. The stores began to close, not all at once, not dramatically, just a slow hemorrhage. 10 stores here, 50 stores there. By 2016, Subway had closed over 300 locations in the United States. By 2017, the number was 500. By 2018, over 1,000. The closures were described in press releases as optimization and strategic restructuring. The reality was simpler. Franchisees were failing. They could not afford the fees. They could not compete with the Subway across the street. They could not survive the reputational damage from Jared. They could not keep the lights on. They closed. They walked away. They left behind empty storefronts with faded yellow and green signs and the smell of bleach and failure. And the quality declined. Subway had always been mediocre. But mediocre is acceptable when it is fast and cheap and convenient. But now, the mediocrity felt sinister. Customers noticed that the vegetables looked tired. The lettuce was brown at the edges. The tomatoes were mealy. The onions were soft. The meat looked grey under the fluorescent lights. The bread smelled more like chemicals than yeast. The employees looked exhausted, moving with the mechanical efficiency of people who stopped caring months ago. The counters were sticky with spilled soda and dried mayonnaise. The bathrooms were nightmares. Toilets that didn't flush properly, sinks with no soap, mirrors smudged with fingerprints and despair. The entire experience felt like punishment for everyone involved. Stories began to circulate online, Reddit threads, Yelp reviews, Twitter rants. Former employees described nightmare working conditions, franchisees paying them under minimum wage, no breaks, no overtime, managers screaming at them for using too many napkins or giving customers too much meat. Sexual harassment ignored by corporate. Health violations covered up. Expired food sold anyway because throwing it out meant losing money. The stories were specific. They were credible. And they were everywhere. Health inspectors found violations, rodent infestations in storage areas, mold growing in bread ovens, expired ingredients left in refrigerators, employees not washing hands between handling money and food, cutting boards contaminated with bacteria, ice machines filled with slime. These were not isolated incidents. These were patterned, systematic failures that occurred because the franchisees were too broke, too exhausted, too demoralized to maintain the standards Subway claimed to require. And when inspectors issued citations, Subway blamed the franchisees. Individual failures, not systemic rot. Never systemic rot. The advertising became desperate. Subway spent over $400 million a year trying to convince people to care. They hired new spokespeople, athletes, celebrities, Stephen Curry, Serena Williams, Tom Brady, people who represented health and discipline and excellence, people who would never eat Subway unless a camera was rolling and a check was clearing. Subway bought their faces and plastered them on posters next to $6 sandwiches that tasted like wet cardboard and regret. The commercials emphasized freshness, customization, quality ingredients. The commercials lied. They introduced new menu items, wraps, salads, breakfast sandwiches, flatbreads, signature sandwiches with fancy names like The Monster and The Beast. They redesigned stores with modern aesthetic, wood paneling, Edison bulbs. Subway called it fresh forward. The idea was to make the stores look upscale, contemporary, Instagram-worthy. They spent millions on renovation. The franchisees were required to pay for the updates themselves, often taking on new debt to comply with corporate mandates. The new designs looked better in photographs. In reality, they were the same stores with different lighting. The sandwiches still tasted mediocre. The employees still looked exhausted. The yellow napkins were still thin and disposable. Nothing fundamental changed. The executives cycled through like disposable commodities. Suzanne Greco resigned in 2018 after 3 years of declining sales and mounting criticism. Her replacement was Trevor Haynes, a former executive at Burger King brought in to revitalize the brand. He implemented new marketing strategies, pushed menu innovation, tried to improve franchisee relations. He lasted 18 months. Then came John Chidsey in 2019, another Burger King veteran with a reputation for turnaround. He was aggressive, he pushed hard, he cut costs, he streamlined operations, he tried everything the consultants recommended. None of it worked. The board kept hiring turnaround specialists, people who had salvaged other struggling chains. They studied McDonald's, they studied Chipotle, they studied Panera Bread. They searched for the secret formula that would reverse the decay. They never found it. Because the decay was not a bug. It was the design. The system was working exactly as intended. It was extracting value from franchisees until they failed. And when they failed, new franchisees appeared to replace them. The machine kept running because desperation is renewable. By 2020, Subway faced another crisis. Ireland's Supreme Court ruled that Subway's bread contained too much sugar to legally be classified as bread under Irish tax law. The acceptable sugar content for bread was 2% of the weight of flour. Subway's bread was 10%, 5 times the legal limit. The ruling was specific to Irish tax definition. The court was trying to determine whether Subway qualified for a tax exemption available to bakeries. They ruled that Subway did not qualify because their bread was closer to cake than bread in terms of sugar content. The ruling had no legal impact outside Ireland. The reputational impact was global. How do you sell Eat Fresh when a court declares your bread is closer to dessert? Then came the tuna scandal. In 2021, journalists commissioned lab tests to analyze Subway's tuna sandwiches. The tests found no identifiable tuna DNA in samples from multiple locations. The labs could not determine what the protein source was. It was fish, probably, maybe, but not tuna. Not in any way that could be scientifically verified. Subway denied the claims. They filed lawsuits against the news organizations. They issued statements swearing their tuna was 100% tuna. They provided documentation from suppliers. They offered to let independent labs test their supply chain. None of it mattered. The doubt was planted. Customers looked at their tuna sandwiches differently. If the tuna wasn't tuna, what else was a lie? The pandemic accelerated everything. COVID-19 hit in March 2020. Restaurants closed, dining rooms shut down, foot traffic disappeared. Subway, like every chain, pivoted to delivery and takeout. But Subway was already weak, already declining. The pandemic was not a singular crisis for them. It was a stress test that revealed how fragile the entire system had become. Franchisees who were barely surviving before COVID went bankrupt during it. They could not afford to stay open with reduced revenue. They could not afford to close and stop paying rent. They were trapped. Some took out emergency loans through the Paycheck Protection Program. Some applied for state and federal relief. Some just walked away, leaving the keys on the counter and the yellow napkins stacked next to the register, monuments to failed dreams. By 2021, the DeLuca family had seen enough. Fred was dead. His empire was crumbling. His legacy was tarnished. The machine he built had turned on itself. Suzanne Greco and the rest of Fred's heirs wanted out. They had no interest in sandwiches. They had no interest in franchising. They wanted to liquidate their shares and move on. So they hired investment bankers. They put Subway up for sale, not quietly, publicly. They invited bids from private equity firms, from rival restaurant chains, from anyone with enough capital to buy the largest sandwich chain in the world. The sale process took months. Dozens of firms expressed interest. Most walked away after examining the books. The numbers were ugly. Revenue was declining year over year. Same-store sales were down double digits. Franchisee relations were toxic. The brand was damaged beyond repair in many markets. The infrastructure needed billions in investment. The legal liabilities from franchisee lawsuits were mounting, but one firm saw opportunity where others saw liability. Rourke Capital Group, a private equity firm based in Atlanta that specialized in acquiring distressed restaurant chains. They owned Arby's. They owned Buffalo Wild Wings. They owned Sonic. They owned Carvel. They knew how to extract value from failing brands. They knew how to cut costs and streamline operations and squeeze out whatever revenue remained before moving on to the next acquisition. Rourke Capital made an offer. $9.6 billion, a staggering number for a company hemorrhaging locations and reputation. But private equity does not buy potential. It buys assets. Subway still had 37,000 locations worldwide. Subway still had brand recognition in 110 countries. Subway still had thousands of franchisees locked into contracts paying weekly fees. The real estate portfolio alone was worth billions. The supply chain contracts generated hundreds of millions in kickbacks annually. The machine still functioned. It just needed new management willing to extract the last drops of blood before the carcass was picked clean. The sale closed in April 2024. The DeLuca family walked away with billions. Peter Buck had already died in November 2021, 10 months before negotiations even began, so his estate collected his share. Suzanne Greco retired immediately after the sale, never to be heard from again. The family scattered. Some invested in real estate. Some started charitable foundations. None of them stayed in the restaurant business. They had seen enough. They had extracted enough. They were done. Rourke Capital took control. They announced plans to revitalize Subway, new menu items, modernized stores, improved franchisee relations, better marketing. The promises sounded familiar because they were the same promises Subway had been making for 5 years. But this time, the promises came with the cold efficiency of private equity. There was no sentimentality, no nostalgia, no pretending this was anything other than a transaction. Rourke brought in their own executives. They implemented cost-cutting measures. They closed underperforming locations faster. They renegotiated vendor contracts to extract even more kickbacks. They squeezed franchisees harder while claiming to support them. They were efficient. They were ruthless. They were everything Fred DeLuca had been, except they had no emotional attachment to Subway. It was just another asset in a portfolio, just another brand to monetize before moving on. The yellow napkins, by this point, were mostly gone. Some stores still had them. Most did not. The ones that remained were thinner, cheaper, more translucent. You could see through them if you held them up to the light. They tore if you pulled them too hard from the dispenser. They barely absorbed anything, but they were still yellow, still disposable, still there, sitting in dispensers next to the straws and the ketchup packets and the plastic forks, performing their function until they were thrown away. In the beginning, they represented freshness, cleanliness, the promise that Subway was different, better, healthier than the competition. In the middle, they represented ubiquity. You could find them anywhere. They were everywhere. They were part of the landscape. At the end, they represent something else entirely. They represent disposability. The ease with which empires built on exploitation can be discarded once their usefulness expired. Today, Subway exists. Barely. There are still over 37,000 locations worldwide, though the number shrinks every quarter. The stores look cleaner than they did in 2018. Rourke Capital has invested in renovations. The lighting is better. The signage is updated. The menu boards are digital, but clean is not the same as alive. Walk into a Subway in 2024 and you feel it immediately. The absence of energy. The space exists. People work there. Sandwiches are made. Money changes hands. But there is no soul, no vitality. Just the mechanical repetition of tasks performed by people who know they are part of something dying. The franchisees who survived did so by adapting in ways Subway never intended. Some opened other businesses using Subway as a loss leader just to keep paying the fees and avoid lawsuits. Some work completely alone, opening at dawn and closing at midnight, their hands scarred from years of slicing vegetables and their backs bent from standing on concrete. Others negotiated exits, selling their locations to corporate ownership or simply walking away and letting Subway repossess the equipment. The ones who remain are either too stubborn to quit or too trapped to escape. They are the last believers in a religion that abandoned them decades ago. The employees work for minimum wage or barely above it. They assemble sandwiches with the efficiency of machines. They do not smile. They do not engage. They perform their tasks and collect their paychecks and go home and try not to think about how their labor generates wealth for private equity investors they will never meet. Some are students working part-time. Some are adults working full-time and still qualifying for food stamps. All of them are replaceable. All of them know it. The customers keep coming, though fewer every quarter. They come because Subway is convenient, because it is cheap, because it is there, not because they love it, not because they trust it, because it is functional, a place to buy lunch when there are no other options. They order their sandwiches. They eat them in their cars or at their desks. They throw away the wrappers and the napkins, and they move on with their lives. Subway is not a destination. It is not an experience. It is a transaction, cold, efficient, forgettable. What remains of Fred DeLuca's dream? What remains of 50 years of expansion and extraction and ruthless efficiency? A logo, a slogan no one believed. 37,000 buildings that feel haunted by the ghosts of promises never kept. Thousands of franchisees trapped in contracts they cannot escape. Thousands of employees working for wages that do not cover rent. Millions of customers who eat there out of convenience, not desire. And somewhere, in landfills across the world, mountains of yellow napkins decomposing into soil, returning to the earth they came from, leaving no trace that they ever mattered. Fred DeLuca once said that his goal was to have more Subway locations than McDonald's. He achieved that goal. For several years, he had the largest restaurant chain on earth measured by location count. The press celebrated it. Business schools studied it. He died believing he had built something that would last. Something significant, something that proved the kid from Bridgeport with nothing could become someone who mattered. But size is not the same as success. Scale is not the same as sustainability, and growing faster than your competitors does not mean you are building something that will endure. It just means you are consuming resources faster than they can be replaced. Subway consumed people. It consumed franchisees' savings, their health, their futures. It consumed employees' time and energy and dignity. It consumed customers' trust. It consumed its own reputation. It consumed the goodwill that Fred and Peter built in that first tiny storefront in 1965, when they believed in something more than just growth. And when there was nothing left to consume, when the machine had eaten everything it could reach, it was sold to people who specialize in consuming the remnants, private equity firms that buy dying companies, cut costs, extract whatever value remains, and move on to the next carcass. This is not a story about sandwiches. This is not a story about franchising. This is a story about what happens when ambition forgets humility, when growth becomes the only metric that matters, when human beings are treated as inputs in a machine designed to produce shareholder value. When a 17-year-old kid with a dream becomes a billionaire by building a system that destroys the dreams of thousands of others. Subway did not fail because of Jared Fogle. Subway did not fail because of bad marketing. Subway did not fail because of competition or changing consumer preferences or the pandemic. Subway failed because it was designed to fail. It was built on a model that could only function by exploiting the people it claimed to empower. It was a pyramid scheme disguised as a business opportunity. And pyramids, no matter how large, eventually collapse under their own weight. The machine is winding down now, not with an explosion, not with headlines, not with dramatic bankruptcy filings or Chapter 11 restructuring, just a slow, quiet decline. Stores closing one by one, franchisees walking away, customers finding other options, the yellow napkins disappearing, until one day someone will walk past an empty storefront where a Subway used to be and not even remember what it was. The sign will be gone, the bread oven will be sold for scrap, the counter will be removed, the floor will be ripped up, and all that will remain is a faint smell of yeast and chemicals, bleach and failure. And the knowledge that something was here once, something that promised to be fresh, something that promised to be different, something that promised to be better, something that promised freedom and independence and the American dream wrapped in yellow and green branding and stacked on counters from Tokyo to Toronto, something that millions of people believed in, something that thousands of people invested their lives in, something that made billionaires out of two men and paupers out of thousands more, something that lied.